welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I get to share the April 2026 kit from Love from Lizi. This one is called Sleepy Seas. We have a couple paper packs in this. This one is Drift Away with some beautiful papers that I'm going to be using in my video on the Love for Lizi channel, in some cards there. Some gorgeous foiled papers in a few different colors as well as textures. Then some peel-off stickers. I don't actually use the peel-off stickers in the cards that I'm creating this month, but I always love peel-off stickers for their thin lines. They create some excellent detail. There is an embellishment pack that has a lot of different embellishments in it. There's a bunch of different trims that you could use on your cards, as well as gemstones, confetti that you could use for a shaker card. Those little cloud stones are absolutely adorable. Some sand that I'll be using on one of my cards, plus a couple dies here. We've got an anchor and a ship's wheel. This has kind of a nautical, celestial theme to it with some floral. So I use the floral pre-printed die cuts on my video on the Love from Lizi channel. This one I'm focusing on the nautical ocean theme. So the stamp set, the set that I showed a few moments ago, I'll be using that on all of my cards. The cardstock I'm going to be using for my layers. There is some acetate, some mesh or whatnot. This paper pack here, I'll be using them for the layers for the backgrounds of my cards. And then I'm also going to be using the pre-printed die cuts on a couple of my cards. These images are absolutely gorgeous. I love the color palette with them. The color palette goes with Celestial Nautical, but I think it's just such a beautiful one with those dark navy blues and the gold colors. There is a lot of different pre-printed die cuts in this pack. As I'm putting them out, I'm separating them into themes. So you can see the top left there is the oceany nautical ones. The top right is more the florals. Those are the ones that I'll be using in the video on the Love from Lizi channel. There are some sentiments. I don't use those sentiments because they just didn't fit what I wanted, as well as the fact that the sentiments in the stamp set work well with what I was planning on creating. And then we also have a few celestial pre-printed pieces. I'm going to be using the Stitched Arches die set for the layers for the card to make them interesting. This has a ton of different sizes, so you can pick and choose which ones are going to work for the cards that you're going to create. For the papers, I'm mainly using the printed papers as well as the cardstock in the kit. The only other cardstock I'm adding are my A2 card bases. So this is a new stamp set that I haven't used before, so I'm using a white eraser and just rubbing on the stamping surface, then using a soft brush to remove the eraser bits. This just takes away any possible manufacturing residue on the stamp and helps it take ink just a little bit better. I have a smaller arch with the cream cardstock from the pack, and I'm just using an embossing ink pad to stamp those waves along the back of this arch shape. As I was doing that, I was rotating my stamp, so it's not going to be a repeating pattern going all the way up. Once I'm done that, I put it on a scrap piece of paper, pour on some ivory pearl embossing powder from Love from Lizi. I absolutely love the color of this gold. I'm not typically a real gold fan. I don't love the color yellow, but this is absolutely beautiful. It's almost like a pastel gold, and it's absolutely stunning with the pearl finish to it. It's a really nice, subtle look for the backgrounds of cards, and I'm going to be using it on several of them for the embossed detail. I'm also going to be using some ivory pearl as well as some raven embossing powder, but I really love that gold. It's absolutely stunning. So once I have that piece embossed with my embossing tool, I'm using a light blue ink to ink blend around the outside edges of that arch shape. It's just going to bring out those waves a little bit more. It's going to add blue to that cream cardstock. I'm trying to get it just around the outside edges and frame it in just a little bit. I'm not trying to get really dark ink blending on here. Now I want to have some sentiments for my cards, and at this point I hadn't decided exactly how I wanted them to be on the cards. I don't have matching dies for these sentiments, so either they need to be fussy cut or trimmed out. What I end up doing is just stacking them on this piece of cardstock, leaving some space between each one of them so I can pick and choose if they all get used the same or if they all get used different. In the end, I choose to die cut them with the Stitched Rectangles die set and have all of those sentiments the same die cut with one of the stitched rectangles. I thought it looked neat, and I thought it was going to look better than if I had fussy cut around them. So I'm stamping them with that embossing ink. I put some embossing powder tool in my cardstock here. This is just the ivory cardstock from the card kit. Then I pour that oyster pearl embossing powder on top and heat emboss that. Now, when I put these on here, like I said, I didn't know exactly how I was going to cut them out. So I just stacked them towards the right side of the cardstock, thinking if I wanted to have them as a strip, I would likely want that sentiment towards the right side of the card. Another option here is waiting for each card and deciding for each one how you want them to do them, or want them done or to look, and then to do them separately. I opted to do them all at once. So I'm going to start layering my pieces together. You can see this lower one here. I have an arch cut out of that arch piece. Each one of those solid papers in the kit, there's one piece to it, and I really liked that navy with the prints, so I wanted to extend it as much as possible. So what I did was take my arch for the base of the card, and then I cut a smaller arch from the center of it. We're going to have the printed paper on top of it, as well as a couple other layers. No one's ever going to know anything was cut out of there, and it's just going to extend that cardstock a little bit. I wanted to add a touch of that oyster pearl embossing powder, or sorry, ivory pearl embossing powder around the outside edges. So I just rubbed the outside edges of my die cut here in that embossing ink, and then dipped it in that embossing powder, and now I can melt it. So this has more of an organic look to it. It's not going to be a completely perfect line around it, but it looks absolutely beautiful and it frames it in really, really nicely. For all of my die cuts, I'm using a liquid glue. It's in a fine line bottle. I use this for gluing most of my cards together. I love using a liquid glue because it gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place, and then they're stuck for good. It starts to grab really quite quickly. The only time it doesn't start to grab quite quickly is when I use like mirror cardstock or cardstock that is non-porous. Then it takes a little bit longer to dry, but it does start to hold it after a bit. So I just have to be a little bit more patient with that. To give the stingray here a little bit more dimension, I'm using some foam pop dots. These aren't really thick foam pop dots, so it's not going to give it a ton of dimension, but it's just going to pop it off of that card just a little bit more than if I had glued it down flat. So at this point, I had decided to use the Stitch Rectangles die. You can see how many different sizes there are in the pack. So it's perfect for creating a bunch of different layers, as well as deciding on a certain size to cut a sentiment like I'm doing here. I'm using some temporary tape on the die so that it stays in place while I'm doing my die cutting. I'm going to do one here on screen. The rest of them I'm doing off screen. They're all exactly the same. It's very repetitive. Now, I have this gold powder on white or on ivory cardstock. For some of them, I'm just going to leave it as is, and some of them I'm going to ink blend on top of it to let that gold powder show up. On camera, it looks a lot more subtle than it is in real life. It's still subtle-ish in real life, but you can definitely read that sentiment. On camera, it looks like it's more closer in color than it actually is. So for the first sentiment, I used a dark blue ink, and then I used some paper towel on top of it to remove any possible ink on top of that embossed sentiment. That way it just shows up a little bit better. I can remove that ink really easily with some dry paper towel. There are some adhesive gems in the embellishment pack for this kit. I'm going to use this on the background just to add a touch of sparkle, a little bit more texture to it. I like to use a die pick with those and just kind of pierce it into the adhesive behind there, and then lay it on my card and just press it down. They're really, really easy to use. So that is the first card. I absolutely love that stingray. I think it's so cute. For the second card, I'm going to do the same thing or a similar thing. I'm going to use one of the whale pre-printed die cuts. I have a cream piece here that I'm going to use for the background on my card. I really liked the look of the waves behind there. But what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to flip my arches upside down. Most of the time, until this very card, I would do my arches with the flat side down and the arch side at the top. And I kind of thought why it doesn't necessarily need to be. So with the whale shape, I just thought it worked well to have them upside down. So that's what I'm going to be doing with this one. So just like my last one, the background here is done the same, as in it is stamped with embossing ink. I've put that ivory pearl embossing powder on top of it, and then I'm heat embossing that powder with my embossing tool. Now I am going to do some ink blending on the background of this, but this time I'm going to cover the entire thing. I'm not just going to do just around the edges. This is going to have that embossing showing up a lot more. I start with a light blue, and then I intended to go with a medium blue, but I accidentally grabbed my darker blue pad and didn't realize it until I thought I was grabbing my dark pad. That's when I realized the error that I made. So what I'm trying to do here is make it so that my ink ink is light towards the top because we're closer to the surface, darker towards the bottom because we're deeper into the ocean. So I wanted to add a little bit of extra texture. So the ink that I'm using is water reactive. So I just put a little bit of water in my hand and then splattered it on that background. You don't see it a lot, especially on the lighter color of the ink, because there's not as much contrast between that lighter ink and that cream, the cream cardstock, but it does add a little bit of subtle, interesting texture. For the large mat for this, I use that gold mirror cardstock that is in the that foil and glitter cardstock pack. Then I have one of the printed papers for the next size down. Then I'm going to do my embossed and ink blended background for the next layer. I have a large acrylic block there that I like to layer or hold things down with, especially when it's cardstock on top of non-porous surfaces like that foil. I want to make sure that everything has good contact and it's nice and flat on there. Then I have one of the wave die cuts from the pre-printed die cut pack. And just like my last one with the stingray, I want to pop up my whale just a little bit. Now, like I said before, these are thinner foam pop dots, so they don't have a ton of dimension. You could easily use ones that have a lot more dimension to them. I didn't necessarily want it sticking out a lot. I just wanted it to have a little bit more of a popped up presence than the waves die cut. You can also see that I used quite a few of those pop dots. I wanted to make sure that the die cut was nice and well supported. So once I have the backing off of all of those, I can add that to or on top of the wave. Then I'm going to add my sentiment. I'm going to add it to the top right corner here, gluing that down with that liquid glue. Now, once again, I'm going to use those gems here. I want them to look a little bit like air bubbles from the whale. So I'm just kind of putting them on that side, going up from the whale, doing the same thing as I did last time, using that die pick to pierce into the adhesive and press them down. It makes it really easy to put these down. Another option would be, I've seen people use like an X-Acto knife, using the blade of the X-Acto knife in the same way. It's a little bit more flat than a die pick is. So here is the finished second card, and I love the look of that arch with that whale upside down. I think it blends perfectly. For the next two cards, I'm going to be using the stamp set, and I'm going to be watercoloring the images. Now, I am working with watercolor cardstock here. I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the only other cardstock I added was the white card bases. I forgot about the fact that I was watercoloring here, and you can't watercolor on regular cardstock. You need watercolor cardstock here. So this is watercolor cardstock. I'm going to be stamping and heat embossing my images, and then I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending for my background first, and then add that watercolor. So first I stamp my waves, and then I pour oyster pearl embossing powder on it. I'm using two different pearl ones. The ivory pearl has the gold look to it. Oyster pearl is a white pearl. So I thought that would work well for those waves. Next, I'm going to be stamping and embossing my whale. I'm going to be using the Raven Black embossing powder for this. I want to make sure that he sticks out from that background. Another option would be to use that oyster pearl with it, but I didn't necessarily want him to have a white outline to him. I thought the black was going to be a better choice for this. So I stamped that whale, then pour the powder on top. You can see that I got a little bit of fingerprints on my watercolor cardstock while I've been working. So just using a soft brush to clean that powder off before embossing is the way to do that. You don't want to emboss it while that's still there. It's going to create kind of a muddied image. So just a soft brush will brush that embossing powder away and clean up that image before you heat emboss it. And this is why we use the embossing powder tool to help prevent things like that, but sometimes they still happen. I think I had done it before the waves, but I don't believe I did it right before stamping the whale. So by touching that cardstock, you add little oils from your fingers, and that's what the embossing powder sticks to. So once my whale is embossed, I'm going to use those same blues that I used for the ink blending from the last card, and I'm going to ink blend my background, and then I'm going to watercolor my images. And just like my last one, I want the upper part to be light and I want the bottom part to be dark, like the white, or the light would be closer to the light on the surface. The dark is closer to the bottom of the ocean. So I'm going to use that dark blue that I've been ink blending with, and I'm going to watercolor inside the detail of the waves, just using a water brush. This water brush has water in the handle. So to my right, I have a piece of paper towel, and I'm going to be using that to clean my brush in between changing colors. I'm going to keep the color palette really quite simple with this. I don't necessarily want to add a lot of color, but I do want to make sure that I have nice oceany colors. For my whale, I have a silver pad here that is water soluble. I'm going to use that to color in the whale. Now, because I ink blended it, that color, that silver, is going to blend in with that little bit of ink that I used for my ink blending. When I'm doing this, I'm trying to make it so that the bottom of the whale is a little bit darker than the top. So I'm concentrating that silver on the bottom and then the middle line of the whale, following the lines from that stamped image. It blends in with that blue just a little bit more as it's drying. Right now it looks fairly subtle, but it does blend in a little bit more, and you can see once it's dry that it has a little bit of a different color tone than the background because of blending those two inks. Now, when I did my first layer with that silver, it wasn't quite heavy enough, so I cleaned off my surface, pressed my pad into my surface again so that I had some fresh ink to work with, and then added another layer of that color to it. Another option here is to use that brush to remove some of that blended color on that background, just to lighten that up a little bit more and have it show a little bit better from that background. So once I have that done, I can set that aside so that it can dry, and I can start adding my layers to my card. Now, I started with one of the printed papers. This one just looks like waves, and I thought it was really pretty for the background for this. For my next layer, I have another piece of that navy cardstock, and I wanted to have that powder around it, the gold powder around it. So I just used that pad to rub around the outside edges, pour the ivory pearl powder around the outside edges, and then I'll heat emboss. So that's just going to tie in the gold with the gold colors in the printed paper on the largest layer there. So once I have that embossed, I can glue that to the base of my card. Now I'm going to add a little bit of that same gold to the outside of my sentiment piece, just to tie those in as well. Now here I have to be a little bit more careful because this piece is just a little bit smaller, and I want to make sure that I'm not putting my fingers in the warm melted powder. So I am being fairly careful as I'm doing it. When you're working with the embossing tool, you want to make sure that you're pointing that tool away from your fingers because it can get quite hot. I want to make sure that everything is melted, and it was a little bit harder with that smaller piece on there. Once that is done, I set that aside to cool for just a few moments while I'm adding the rest of the layers to the card. So first we have that navy piece with the gold frame from that ivory pearl embossing powder around it. Then we have our watercolor image that has dried now, and then we can add our sentiment to the bottom. And I'm going to add it to the bottom left corner for this card. Typically when I'm adding sentiments, I'll just kind of pick an area that seems to be open. So for this one, I ended up doing it on the bottom left, so it covered some of the waves. You still see a ton of those waves, so it's not covering important detail to it, but I like to put them in an area that's open. Another option would be, say, towards the top left, but because we have the curve from the arch, I didn't want to put the rectangle on there. I didn't think it suited it quite as much as the bottom left. Now I wanted to add a little bit of that sand on the waves to kind of mimic the foam on waves. So I just used my liquid glue in some of the detail parts from the waves. I didn't cover it completely. I still want to see that oyster pearl embossing from the waves. So I just put that liquid glue on there, poured the sand so it's going to stick to anywhere that I put the glue. And because I have that glue in a fine bottle, I can be as precise with it as I need to be. Then I add some of those gems scattered around the outside of the card just to add that texture and that sparkle. Now I could have put it just on top of the whale so that it looked like air bubbles. I started with that, and then I opted to put a few scattered around as well because I just really liked the look of them, and I liked how it tied in the gold from that printed paper as well as the gold from the embossing around one of the arches and the sentiment. So for my next card here, I'm going to once again use that stamp set. I stamped the waves at the bottom of my arch, used the oyster pearl powder, same as the last one. For this one, though, I'm going to be using the boat image from that stamp set. I decided I wanted to have it separate, so I stamped it on my scrap piece of watercolor cardstock. I thought this was ivory cardstock earlier, but it's actually watercolor cardstock because I want to watercolor the sails as well as the base of my boat, and I want to fussy cut this so I can pop it up just a little bit. I want to make sure that it has a little bit more presence than just the waves at the bottom. So I stamped it with that embossing ink, then I used the Raven Black embossing powder on it before heat embossing that. Now, I choose to heat emboss my images often because I love the extra detail and the extra shine, as well as those raised edges that it gives them. If you prefer, you can just use ink and stamp it flat, but I do like the fact that the lines have that little bit of shine as well as that raised edge. I'm going to use my dark blue for the base of the boat, making sure that the color is darker towards the bottom and then lighter towards the top. And then I'm using that silver for the sails of the boat. This is a water-based or water-soluble ink, so it's really easy to watercolor with it. I often use my ink pads, the water-soluble ones, for watercoloring because it just gives them an extra use to it. Another option here would be to use metallic watercolors or just watercolor paints. Because I have those ink pads and because they will work, I just use those. So once I have those watercolored, I can put that to the side, let that dry for a few moments before I go to do my fussy cutting on there. I'm going to do some light ink blending on this background here, keeping the top light and the area by my waves dark. By making that area by my waves dark, it makes them show up a lot more, as well as it just looks a little bit more like water in my opinion. I'm going to watercolor those waves the same as I did my last card, just coloring in some of the detail on the inside of those waves. I didn't do the entire bottom because when I'm watercoloring it, it's a little bit darker than when I ink blended it, and I like the contrast between the look of the ink blended ink as well as the watercolored ink. I didn't necessarily want it to be all really dark. I wanted it to have some areas that were light and dark and have that contrast. And as I was watercoloring that, I just really liked the look of it. I'm going to ink blend around the outside edges for my sentiment just to have that framed a little bit and show off that a little bit more. So I use the dark blue for that as well. Another option here would be to ink blend over the whole thing, but because we're putting it onto a background that's also ink blended, it would be hidden a little bit more by doing that. I have some detail scissors that I'm using to do my fussy cutting. When I first started fussy cutting, I was adding a little bit of a halo around it so it would pop off the end just a little bit more. And then after doing that one side of the sail, I just decided that I wanted it cut right on the side of that embossing. So when I'm doing my fussy cutting, you can see that my scissors in my right hand pretty much don't move. They kind of stay in the same position for the most part, but I do use my left hand in order to move that paper into the path of my scissors. This is the best way to do fussy cutting and get a good look with it. Now, once I have that done, there's that center part there that isn't colored. I just used my ink blending brush and just ink blended that so that it would match the background of my card. Now I wanted to create a shaped card base for this, so I used the largest of the Stitched Arches dies, cutting 2 of those with my white cardstock, used my score tool to score about 4.5 inches from the bottom, folded that score line to make sure that it had a really good hinge to it, and then I put glue above that score line and glued those 2 pieces together. I'm using the mirror gold for one of my layers for this, and you can see that I die cut an anchor right out of the center of it. I wanted to have that anchor detail on the front of the card. I ran out of this cardstock. Again, this is a great way to extend your cardstock. This is going to be covered with my watercolor image, and we're really not going to see underneath there anyways, my watercolor image press plus this printed paper. So we're not going to see under there anyways. So it's a great way to extend that cardstock and get more use out of it. Another option would be to use the gold glitter cardstock that was in this pack, but I just didn't think the glitter cardstock worked for the anchor, and I didn't want it for the matte either. So once I have my layers together, I'm going to add that anchor towards the bottom right of the card. Then I'm using my foam pop dots on the back of that sailboat. This way it can be popped up above the waves. So once I have those pop dots on there, you can see that I have pretty much the whole back of that boat covered with those pop dots. I can add that to the card, and you can choose whether you want it to go with the waves or not. You can see how I kind of rocked it back and forth to see, but I just thought it was going to look better on the card if it was straight up and down. Now at this point, I decided that those sails didn't pop as much, so I'm using a gold pad. This is the same as the silver pad I've been using. It's water soluble, and it's going to tie in with my gold matte around the outside edges. It's going to tie in with the gold embossing or the oyster or ivory pearl embossing for my sentiment. And it's all going to tie in with the anchor. It just makes that sail pop a little bit more on that background. I like it a lot more. And I usually don't watercolor pieces after they're on cards, but it just looks a lot better with the gold on those sails than it did with the silver. So one last step here, I'm going to be using the tiniest of the confetti in that star confetti package that is in the embellishment package and just put them on the night sky. So I put some dots of glue. I'm using my tool to pick them up and place them into those dots of glue. There's a few different sizes in there, but I just thought these subtle stars in the background was going to be more effective than having a bunch of different sizes. And I like the way they catch the light. They just twinkle just a little bit, so it makes it really nice. It almost looks like a starry sky behind it. You could, if you want, when doing the ink blending, if you knew, I didn't really think about doing the stars ahead of time, you could do a darker sky and then those stars would show up even more. I love that shaped color or shaped base for that card though. I think it's really effective. Then we have our whale here that is watercolored with that silver, and you can see the silver reflecting. You can also see how mixing that silver with the color that was ink blended on the background changes the color of the whale or the color tone of the whale from the colors on the background and helps them to show up just a little bit more. Then we have our one with the pre-printed die cuts with the whale with the arches upside down. I kind of think this might be my favorite. I really like the arches that way. I'm going to have to definitely do that again. And then our very first card with the stingray. You'll find all the Love from Lizi products that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.